We have a good number present. We appreciate the presence of everyone. As always, I hope you've got your Bible with you and are eager to take that and study with us as we make an appeal to the text of God and make application for our present day. I encourage you to turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 14. This is where we were in our Bible class last week. And as we talked about Jesus walking on the water, we made several points that were very brief because of the amount of material we're looking at in our Bible classes. And then on Wednesday evening, Drew gave an invitation based upon this text and looked at some things we did not look at and enhanced our understanding. An excellent invitation he gave. And I want us to look even further at that, to look at even more information found here in the text that may enhance our understanding, not only of this event, but help us to understand some things in our own life. Let's begin at verse 22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went to the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And so he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and beginning to sink. He cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got in the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Three miracles take place in this context. One, Jesus walks on the water. Secondly, he causes Peter to walk on the water. And then thirdly, at verse 32, when they got in the boat, the wind suddenly ceased. The second time, it caused the storm to cease. There are parallel accounts to be found in Mark 6, John chapter 6. But in those accounts, they are not as full as the discussion found here in our text in Matthew chapter 14. We'll reference those only as they enhance our understanding of Matthew's account. Now, this is taking place in the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, as we pointed out in our Bible class. The text says they went to the other side. Well, that usually has a reference in a certain direction, but it depends on where your starting point is, as we saw in our Bible class this morning. Mark says in Mark chapter 6 that they went to Bethsaida, and yet John's account says they went to Capernaum, or went toward Capernaum. We pointed out in our Bible class, if you were not there are two Bethsaidas. There is the Bethsaida of Julius, but then there's the Bethsaida of Galilee. So they were coming across in that direction toward Capernaum, or toward Bethsaida of Galilee. And then the text says in John chapter 6, they were about 3 or 4 miles out into the sea when the events take place. This took place, according to our text, in the fourth watch of the night. That's in the early hours of the morning, between about 3 and 6 a.m. So it's dark, early hours of the morning. They're out in the middle of the sea. There is a storm that has arisen. And then Jesus comes walking to them. Hendrickson said this about our story. He said, this section pictures separation, storm, and stress in verses 22 to 24. And fright in verses 25 and 26, and reassurance in verse 27, and wavering in 28 to 32, and worship in 32 and 33. What a transition of things that take place here in our story. The disciples were sent away. Jesus stayed back. The text says to go to the mountain to be by himself and to pray. Apparently, they were expecting him to come in another boat. We don't learn that in Matthew, but that is an implication in John chapter 6, that they apparently were expecting Jesus to take another boat and join them. They would not have been surprised had Jesus came in a boat. And so they see a boat coming, and maybe they think, then this must be Jesus. But there are two things that captured their attention, and will capture ours as well as we read the story. The first was, the storm had strong winds. The storm had strong winds. In fact, verse 24 said not only were there strong winds, it was contrary. And in verse 30, the wind was boisterous. This was no small little breeze that was blowing, but it was beginning to stir a storm on the sea. The second thing that captured their attention, they see Jesus walking on water. They've never seen anything like that before. Oh, I don't mean to imply they've not seen miracles before. They've seen things just as extraordinary as walking on the water, but they've never, according to our record, seen Jesus walking on water before. And that captured their attention. So at verse 29, Peter asked, if it's you, if that's really you there, then bid me to come to you. So notice beginning at verse 29, Peter said, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. He didn't say, come closer to me. If that's really you, you bid me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. How far was it? I don't know. It was close enough they could have a conversation from the boat to wherever Jesus was standing. It was far enough, though, that he had to walk toward Jesus. And he came down out of the boat and began to walk toward Jesus. But I'm interested in verse 30 now. Then when he saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and beginning to sink. You might underline that in your Bible. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. What I want you to notice is, this text doesn't tell us that Peter sank. And when we retell the story, sometimes we may say that Peter began to walk on water and he sank. It didn't say he sank. It said beginning to sink. The text doesn't say he completely went under. As we might see someone fall out of a boat and they go down, and they may come back up and they go down a second time, and you hope they don't go down a third time because that may be it. That's not what happened. Go back to verse 30, the text says, and beginning to sink. This simply marks the beginning of the process. So get the picture. Peter says, if it's really you, Lord, bid me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. He climbs down out of the boat and starts walking on the water. And when he turns and sees the boisterous wind, he begins to sink. So let's talk this morning about Peter began to sink. With that story clear on our mind from our study last week and from Drew's invitation, let's talk about Peter began to sink. Now here's our focus point. Our focus is not on the one who is sunk into the depths. You may be thinking, I know of someone who's just sunk into the depths. By that, they never obeyed the gospel and they've gone out into the world and they're in the depths of sin. This is not what this story is about. Or you may be thinking of someone who used to be a faithful child of God and they have departed and they've just given up their faith completely and they don't even resemble anybody who even believes in God. They've sunk into the depths of the sea. This is not what this is about. Our focus is on the one who is beginning to sink. So I ask you the question, are you beginning to sink? If the Lord has bid you to walk on the water and you're walking toward Him, are you beginning to sink? Three things we want to notice about that. Here's the first. Let's talk about the temperament that contributed to that. See, what do you mean by that? Let's talk about the temperament of Peter that very well may have contributed to that, the temperament that may not be wrong within itself. I want to suggest to you that Peter was not a wicked man. He's just being Peter. And if you are familiar with Peter, and most of this crowd is, you just recognize when you read the story, you kind of shake your head and chuckle a bit, that's just Peter. Peter's not a wicked man. He's just being Peter. You say, what do you mean he's just being Peter? Peter was an impulsive and impetuous and at times a reckless man. You say, are you saying it was wrong for him to be impulsive? No. To be impetuous? Not always. Are you saying it was sinful when he would do something reckless, though it may not cross the line? No, I'm not saying that's sin. I'm just saying his characteristic was a man who was impulsive and impetuous, and at times he could be very reckless. You'll recall from your knowledge of Peter that he was always the one in any situation that was always the first one to speak out, whether he was right about what he said or his actions or not. Not only to speak, but to act. Let me give you some examples of that. Let's open our Bibles to the 15th chapter of the book of Matthew. This is familiar territory because we've just come through this. You remember when Jesus was talking in this context about how that, not that which comes into the mouth, put into the mouth that defiles a man, but that which comes out of the mind of man. And I'm paraphrasing that, of course, but it was Peter now, not the other apostles. It was Peter in verse 15. He said, explain to us this parable. Now, nothing wrong with him saying that. I'm just trying to illustrate to you, he was always the first one to jump out there and say something. Let's go further. This is our study this morning. When Jesus said, who do you say that I am? It was Peter who jumped out and said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. He was right about that. And he had every right to say that. I'm just saying, he was the first one always to speak. Well, we're not through with our study this morning. You remember from this morning, beginning in Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, Jesus had said, I'm going to go to Jerusalem and they'll kill me and I'll be raised the third day. It was Peter now who jumped out quickly and said, far be it from you, Lord, this shall not happen to you. The others may have felt that way, but it was Peter who said it. Are you beginning to get the picture that he's impulsive and impetuous? And at times he's reckless. We're not through with our study from this morning. Let's go to the 17th chapter at verse 4. You remember at the Mount of Transfiguration, here's that inner circle, and Peter was part of that inner circle. And as soon as he sees Jesus and Moses and Elijah, he had this great idea and jumped out with this grand idea, let's build 3 tabernacles there. Well, he was wrong about that. And the statement from the Father is going to tell him he's wrong about that. But nonetheless, I'm illustrating my point. Now let's go over to John chapter 13. Now this one is almost humorous. This is where Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. And you remember that it was Peter, it's not only Peter's feet that are being washed, all the disciples' feet are being washed. But as he comes to Peter, Peter tells him, you will never wash my feet. Well, then Jesus said, well, okay, and I'm paraphrasing. Then if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me. And you remember what Peter said? Well, then here's what I want you to do. I want you to wash my hands and my head also. And he jumps from one extreme to the other. I don't want you to wash my feet at all. Oh, well, I'll wash everything I've got. He is impulsive, impetuous, and at times he's a little bit reckless. Let's go to the 18th chapter. Here's an action, not so much his words. When Jesus is on trial, you remember there was a disciple there that drew a sword and swung his sword real quickly and cut off the high priest's right ear. Who was that? That was Peter. Oh, he was quick to action, wasn't he? And so your question may be, are you saying Peter sinned? No, I'm not saying Peter sinned in that. What I'm saying is, here is a characteristic of a man. His temperament was, he was this impulsive kind of guy, and that very easily could get him in some trouble. And it did. Hendricks said, a most interesting person, this Peter. He seems to do nothing in halves. I like that. Oh, he is an interesting character. He doesn't just go at it a little bit. He goes at it full steam. Hendrickson further says, impulsive Peter is immediately ready for action. He's ready to talk. He's ready to speak. He's ready to ask. He's ready to swing his sword. You say, well, that's a good spirit. Well, yeah. But times that impulsive nature gets you in trouble. And it did with Peter. Now, he's the only one of the disciples in this context to ask to walk on water. That's interesting to me. When they see Jesus walking on the water, it was Peter who said, bid me to come to you. None of the others said anything about it as far as the record shows. And he's the only one that began to sink. See that impulsive, I want to come on the water, okay. But now you're out there. You lose your focus and you began to sink. Peter was the kind of man who was willing to do what anyone else would not be willing to do. And that could easily work to their ruin. Do you ever know of anybody who's always quick to act? They're always quick to respond. They're always quick with an answer. They're always quick to volunteer. And you say, that's a great spirit. And absolutely so. But I'll tell you, there's a point at which that'll get them in trouble. And we'll see more about that as we go along. Now, here's another thing about his characteristic and his temperament. Peter focused too much on Peter, on himself. And that got him in trouble. You see, when he took notice of the wind, he was thinking of himself. He's focused on Jesus. He said, Lord, if that's you, he's focused on Jesus, verse 29. If that's you, Jesus, then bid me to come to you. And he said, come. And he goes. But verse 30 said, he turned and he looked at the wind. And when he did that, he became afraid. As long as he concentrated his attention, Hendrickson said, on Jesus, all went well. But the moment he took the notice of the boisterous winds and the surging waters, he became frightened. As long as he had his eyes on the Lord, he was fine. But suddenly he's become frightened. Now, I want to suggest your temperament may contribute to your beginning to sink. Now, I've just illustrated the fact that Peter's temperament was not wrong within itself. You say, is it wrong? No, that's not wrong to be impulsive and to be the first to speak. But that might have worked toward his ruin. The same with us. Let's take, for example, you may be a person who's headstrong. Well, you know, that might be a good thing if you're headstrong and you're not bowing to pressure. So that's a good thing, isn't it? That I'm not going to allow people to push me around. I've got my opinion, I've got my conviction, and I'm headstrong. Nothing wrong with that within itself. But you know, that headstrong spirit might be that when you need to yield your judgment, that might get you in some trouble. So here's a great characteristic. I like a headstrong person. That's great. But it might get you in trouble. Sometimes people are followers and not leaders. And you say, well, there's nothing wrong with that. Everybody can't be a chief. Everybody can't be a leader, and you're right about that. We're all supposed to be followers. And there's nothing wrong with being a follower who submits to the leadership of others. But sometimes there's a person who's a follower. That means simply that they'll do right as long as they're with people that are right. But when they're in this group, they're going to let this group lead them as well. That being a follower may work to their ruin. Nothing wrong with being a follower. Do you see what I'm trying to suggest? Your temperament may work to your ruin where you begin to sink. Here's someone who's laid back. I mean, they just kind of take it easy. They're easygoing. They don't ever get ruffled about anything. And you say, I like that in a person. That's a great characteristic. I wish more people were kind of laid back. But you know what? That might work to your ruin when things are going south and you're still laid back and your feathers are not ruffled when things are going south spiritually in your family or with your children and you're not bothered at all about that. Maybe things are going south in the church. Maybe error's being taught, but I'm laid back. I'm not going to ruffle feathers. I kind of like this easygoing spirit. See, that might work to your ruin. Here's another thing, like Peter, for example, being impulsive. If you're the one who's always got an answer, always got a question, always want to jump out first, that's great. That was great for Peter. But it also was the first one to volunteer to walk on the water. And had he not been there, he wouldn't have sunk. Here's the idea of being cautious. You say, well, I like being cautious. I like to see people that are cautious. They're very careful about what they do, and they're careful about their associates, and they're careful about what they tolerate. And I like that too. I wish more people were cautious. Have you ever seen someone, though, that was so cautious they were afraid of everything? Do you remember the man who had one talent and he buried the talent because he said, I was afraid. I was scared. Sometimes we're scared of everything. I'm scared to let something happen because, or to encourage someone maybe to take part in service because they may mess up and they may lead us astray. I'm afraid of that. See, being cautious, overly cautious, might work to our ruin. Maybe you're one of those that's quick to speak. Always. I'm sometimes that way, depending on the circumstance, and be the first one to, I've got an answer for that. I've got a response to that. That's great. But that might be the very thing that works to our ruin. Maybe you're a negative person, and you say, well, I don't think of myself as negative. I'm a realist. And I'm not one of these bubbly, over-the-top, okay, that's great. We need realism. We need to look at the negative side of things. But that negative spirit might work to your ruin sometime. Or maybe it's the idea of being gullible. I like people who will be willing to accept what they're told. But that might lead to being gullible where you swallow things you shouldn't swallow. All I'm suggesting is the temperament of Peter may have very well contributed to this problem of his beginning to sink. Here's the second thing. The temperament that contributed, let's talk about the faith that weakened. The faith that weakened. Now, I want to suggest to you Peter's faith weakened for the moment. I don't mean by that his faith was destroyed. No one needs to get the impression Peter's faith was gone. Doesn't have any faith anymore. But it was weakened. Here's the evidence of that. When he saw the boisterous winds, he was afraid, and he, beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. Now notice what the Lord said to him. He stretched out his hand and caught him, and he said to him, O ye of little faith, why did you doubt? The Lord said to him, your faith lost some strength just now. Your faith was weakened. Not gone, but it was weakened. I want to suggest to you that Peter's faith began to sink in familiar waters. There's a point to be made from that. But let's suggest that Peter was in home territory. He is not off in an ocean or a lake he knows nothing about. He was raised on the shores of this very lake, John 1 says, Bethsaida. That's where he was raised. That was his home. This was his backyard. This is what he saw. He was a professional fisherman, Matthew chapter 4 and verse 18. He knew every inch of this water. Now, maybe a large lake to some degree, but about 8 miles wide and 13 miles in the other direction. It's not a humongous lake. He could get to know the entire lake. And as some have suggested, he knew every inch of the waters. And not only that, he was among those who loved him and those who knew him. He was there. The Lord was inside of him. He has his friends back in the boat. We'll say more about them in just a moment. But quite often when one goes away from home, unfamiliar territory, away from their support group of their family and their friends and the church, it is no wonder they begin to sink. You've seen it before. Someone gets married and they move away from home and their faith begins to go south. They go off to college and their faith begins to sink. They're away from their support group, away from home, away from the parents' instruction, the parents' guidance. They may begin to sink. That's not the case with Peter. It could be that even some in our midst are beginning to sink. How so? They might be sinking even though they're in a strong church that they know well. You see, Peter was in familiar territory. It may be that you could begin to sink when you're sitting right in the middle of a strong church that you know well and the church knows you. That could be me. We could begin to sink even though we have a godly family that loves us dearly. You say, how could that happen? Well, you could be right in the midst of a godly family that cares for you and is watching for you, and yet you begin to sink in that familiar territory. You could begin to sink even though you're surrounded by close friends. Peter was. His Lord was close by. His friends were in the boat. He's in familiar territory, and he still began to sink. Same thing could happen to us. I want to suggest to you that Peter began to sink after loyal discipleship. So what do you mean by that? I want to tell you, Peter was no beginner. He's not inexperienced. It is not surprising someone who just came to know the Lord and just has obeyed the gospel and just began their Christian life, that there's some moment when they begin to sink. We're not surprised. They're inexperienced spiritually. Has no reference to their age, talking about their spiritual age. But Peter is no beginner. Let's talk about things he's seen and done. Go back to chapter 14 or chapter 1, John chapter 1. He was called much earlier than this to be a disciple. John chapter 1 demonstrates to us at that moment he understood this man is the Messiah. It's not that I'll follow this man. I'm not sure who he is. But he knows he's the Messiah. For some time he's known that. He's listened. Peter was there in the Sermon on the Mount, heard every bit of that sermon about the kingdom. The next 2 chapters, he witnessed those miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle. He saw all of that. He saw all of that evidence. He was named as one of the apostles. He was chosen to be one of the ones to go forth. And furthermore, John chapter 6, he was there when the 5,000 were fed and again when the 4,000 were fed. He saw all of that. And here's something I'm learning from that story, that one can be faithful and loyal and dedicated. That is no guarantee, that is absolutely no guarantee that they will not begin to sink. 1 Corinthians 10 and in verse 12 says, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. You see, Peter could look around and say, I've been with him, I've been with the Lord, I heard all of his teaching, saw all these miracles, I know exactly who he is and what's going on. In our text this morning, he said, you're the Christ, the Son of God. He knows who he is. There was no guarantee that he wouldn't begin to sink. Here's the third thing about that. And quite interesting to me is that Peter began to sink while on a permitted path. Peter began to sink while on a permitted path. You see, had the Lord forbidden Peter to come, we could understand why he began to sink. Now let's just suppose, we'll go back and look at verse 29, that Peter said, Lord, if that's you, bid me to come to you. And what if the Lord said, no, you can't come. Don't get out of the boat. And then suddenly he gets out of the boat. Well, no wonder he began to sink. I told you not to come. But that's not the case. If he had done that, then he would be doing what he shouldn't be doing. And there are many paths where the Lord said, don't do this, like Galatians 5, the works of the flesh. It is not surprising when one is involved in drunkenness or adultery or fornication or embezzling or whatever the case may be. Here are a number of sins found in the text. Idolatry. Oh, you get involved in that, you're beginning to sink, sinking fast. But that was not the case with Peter. I want to suggest to you that Peter here was going where the Lord had permitted him to go. He was not rebelling and he was not disobeying. He asked permission to come on the water, and the Lord said, come. That is a permitted path. And while on that permitted path is where he began to sink. That's interesting to me. Could it be that we're beginning to sink on a permitted path? You say, how so? I could begin to sink when it comes to worship. Now, if I'm forsaking worship, I may have already sunk. But I could begin to sink while in the midst of worship. Let's look over at 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and in verse 27. You say, what's that all about? Well, as listed on the screen there, it very well may be that I begin to lose my focus. All indication in 1 Corinthians 11, they were assembling together, partaking of the Lord's Supper. But they're making a common meal out of this Lord's Supper. Here's the comment that the apostle made in verse 27. Therefore, whoever eats the bread and drinks this cup in an unworthy manner is guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. Verse 29 says he's to be discerning the body, thinking about what the sacrifice means, what this Lord's Supper represents. You say, what's your point? My point is, I could be right in the middle of worship. That is not only a permitted path, that is a commanded path. And right in the middle of that path, I could lose my focus as Peter did. And I might begin to sink. Are you beginning to sink? Another way I could do that maybe is using liberties. Romans 14 talks about we have every right to eat meats. There were some who opposed the eating of meats, not from a vegetarian standpoint, but from a religious standpoint. They couldn't get their mind away from the concept of idolatry connected with eating of meats. For whatever purpose, they cannot eat those meats, and they think it's wrong to eat those meats. And the point in Romans chapter 14, this is your liberty to eat meats. You have every right to eat meats, but don't use that liberty somehow to infringe upon others. So let's go to Romans chapter 14 and see what he said. You say, well, I've got every right. I've got every right to do that. You're right. No one's saying you don't have a right to eat meats, but notice what said at beginning at verse 19. He said, therefore let us pursue things that make for peace and things by which one may edify another. All right, I got that, Paul. What are you saying? I'm saying this, verse 20. Do not destroy the work of God for the sake of food. In other words, don't abuse your liberty to cause someone else to commit sin. You see the point? Notice now at verse 21, it is good neither to eat meat nor drink wine or anything by which a brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. The idea of offended means he's made to sin, violate his conscience, verse 23. So that's a permitted path. Here's another permitted path, teaching others the gospel. Paul said in Philippians 1, some were doing the right thing, but with the wrong motive. That's a permitted path to teach the gospel. Nothing wrong with that. But if my motive is wrong, I might begin to sink. Or it might be a number of other things. I might be doing something that's not sinful, may not be encouraged, but it's certainly not sinful. For example, maybe it's dating or marrying a non-Christian. You say, well, that's not sinful. No one said it was. No, it's not. It may not be wise, but it's not sinful. But that might be what causes you to begin to sink. Or maybe it's where you go to school. By that I'm talking about you go off to college. You may go off to college and you may go to a town where there's not a sound church or the church is weak. So for the next 2 to 4 years, you may be in a congregation that has no real solid basis and your faith is going to get weaker. Or it may be a school that's going to indoctrinate you in things you shouldn't be knowing, in things you should not be believing. You say that's a permitted path. It certainly is, but it may be that permitted path where we begin to sink. It might be the type of employment. You say there's nothing wrong with working here. No, but it may be that it puts you in an environment wherein your faith is going to deteriorate. There may be a tax on your faith. Or it may be you miss a lot for your own sickness or maybe some family member sickness. And you say, I think the Lord approves of that. And I'll grant you that, but your faith's going to get weaker. It always has and it always does. And that may be a permitted path, but you may begin to sink because you're on a permitted path. Peter was, and he began to sink. I want to suggest to you something else. Peter began to sink when he began to fear. We see that in verse 30. Now, there is no evidence. There is no evidence that the winds had grown more fierce while Peter was walking on the water. Maybe. But you read through this text, read through the parallel accounts, and I don't think you'll find any evidence that when Peter starts to walk, the winds begin to get worse. What I'm suggesting is he began to sink when he began to fear. Here's the problem. He took his eyes off of the Lord and onto the wind. Do you notice that? Let's go back to our text, Matthew chapter 14, and notice in verse 30 that when he saw, now let's go back to verse 29. The Lord said, come, and when Peter came down from the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. Got his eyes focused toward Jesus. But when he saw that the winds were boisterous, he turns his attention to the wind. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. He took his eyes off the Lord and onto the wind. Now he's afraid, and now he's not any different from any other. Now the winds and the waves are a terrible threat. They weren't before. But now they are. I want to suggest to you that we could do the very same thing. How? When I begin to take my eyes off the Lord and I begin to question His provision, that's what worry is about, Matthew chapter 6. When I begin to worry about my daily necessities and I begin to worry about my financial matters to the point I just don't think the Lord's going to provide, as if the Lord's not going to provide for me, I'm beginning to take my eyes off the Lord and I'm focusing on the storm. And I may begin to sink. It may be when I fail to cast my burden upon Him. Cast your cares upon Him because He cares for you, 1 Peter 5. When I'm trying to carry my own burden and I've forgotten to take it to the Lord because I'm so focused on my burden and my problems. I don't know what I'm going to do. I didn't turn it over to the Lord. I didn't pray to the Lord. I didn't turn it over to Him and leave it with the Lord as if He's going to handle it. I feel like I've got to handle just as much as He does. I've taken my eyes off the Lord and onto the storm. Or when I begin to think I might have a better way than the Lord. There's a way that seems right unto man, but the ends thereof are the ways of death. Proverbs 14:12. And when I begin to focus on my problem, when I begin to focus on my way and turn my eyes away from the Lord, then I begin to sink. Well, thirdly, we've talked about the temperament that contributed, the faith that weakened, let's talk about the people that were near. The text says at verse 30, beginning to sink. And as he began to sink, there were some people close by. Who were they? Well, they were the disciples. These were his friends. Where are they? They're in the boat. He just stepped down out of the boat onto the water. And so here's some people that are near. You have to wonder if these disciples even noticed anything before Peter cries out, Lord, save me. If they did, the text does not indicate that. But you have to wonder, did they notice he's walking on the water? His feet are not even going, wait a minute, the feet, his feet are going under now. He is beginning to sink. Did they notice that? I don't know. They had trouble because of the early hours of the morning. They didn't even recognize Jesus. If they noticed it, there's no record of that. What I'm suggesting to you as a disciple could begin to sink with little notice. He's beginning to sink. And there is no indication that these disciples begin to holler out, you're sinking. Watch out, Peter. No indication. One of the reasons for that is because this person may not have reached the point they're going completely under. See, we may have people right in our midst that are beginning to sink. You say, have you noticed? No, I hadn't noticed. And that's probably because they haven't gone under yet. That may be why the disciples didn't say anything if they didn't. He's just beginning to sink. No indication that he's gone completely under. Sometimes brethren and friends and even family may not recognize the change that's going on within because it hadn't manifested outwardly yet. There's some thought changes going on. Their faith may be getting weaker. Their practice may be draining. It may be things are changing in their minds and they're just beginning to sink, but we haven't taken notice of that. The outward impression is everything's okay. And what I want to suggest to you is that quite often we can begin to sink when our brethren and our friends are right around us. At least they're in the boat nearby. But there's something else. There's somebody else there, and that was the Lord. Jesus was on the water. Peter gets out on the water and begins to walk toward him, and Jesus is right there close. You see, as Peter began to sink, his Lord's not very far away. And Peter knew where he could cry for help. As soon as he began to sink, he said, Lord, save me. He knew where to cry. And while he begins to sink, he's not lost his faith in the Lord. That's why I mentioned that earlier. It's not a case where Peter's thrown his faith away. Now, he was rebuked for his lack of faith, that's true. But his faith isn't gone. His faith isn't completely shot. He still believes in his Lord. The Lord was close enough for him to stretch out his hand and to save him. And at the same time, rebuke him. What I want to suggest is that when you realize you're beginning to sink, you remember the Lord's close by. You may say, and we'll ask some questions here in just a moment, you may say, I recognize I'm beginning to sink. I haven't sunk, but my feet are getting underwater by this point. When you recognize that, the Lord has promised He'll never leave you nor forsake you, Hebrews 13 in verse 5, and it may be time for you to cry out to the Lord who says He's nearby, Lord, save me. I need your help. I don't want to go down any further. And so let's raise the question, are you beginning to sink? Peter did. His was physical and literal. Are you beginning to sink? Do you find that you're not reading and studying your Bible as much as you used to? You say, boy, I used to read and study all the time. I used to get ready for every Bible class. I read all the chapters for every class and read them not only once, but read them more than once. Or maybe you did daily reading or whatever the case may be. I used to study my Bible more. But I do notice I'm not doing that like I used to. You say, preacher, are you saying I've sunk? I hadn't said you sunk. I hadn't said you've gone under. You might be beginning to sink. Or you say, well, I'll tell you what. I do pray, but are you praying less than you used to? Did you used to spend more time in prayer and pray about more things, but you still pray? You haven't given up prayer altogether, but you don't pray as much as you used to or about as much as you used to? You say, preacher, are you saying we've sunk? No. I hadn't said that. I'm saying that might be a sign you're beginning to sink. Do you find yourself pulling away from godly friends? You're not spending as much time around Christians. Let me footnote here to say, have you ever noticed sometimes when someone finally does sink and they've gone completely away from the Lord, that you can track back and you see, you know what? There was a time when they started pulling away from Christians. Just gradually. They didn't spend much time with Christians. They didn't spend as much time with their friends that are godly. Do you find this? That you're associating more with people of the world? Do you find that? I'm finding it more joyful maybe to spend more time with my friends from school or from work or wherever it may be. And that association is kind of building while my relationship with Christians is deteriorating. You say, are you saying I'm sunk? No, you haven't sunk yet maybe. We're talking about beginning to sink. Are you losing your focus in worship? So what do you mean? Well, is it that we sit and sing a song and then when we get through you don't even know what we sung and you're not even thinking of the meaning of the words? We have the Lord's Supper and you're looking around thinking about lunch and you're not thinking about the meaning of the Lord's Supper? Do you endure worship period or are you engaged in worship? You're saying I sunk? No, I'm saying you may begin to sink. Does spirituality mean less now than it did in the past? Are you beginning to sink? And are you becoming more absorbed in work and in the material world? You say, work's got me. I got it. I got that. I understand that. I understand work. But are you so wrapped up in your work and in the material things of life that spirituality is being kind of pushed to the back burner? That might be a sign we're beginning to sink. Peter began to sink. Do you see the temperament that contributed to that? Do you see how his faith weakened? And do you see the people that were near? His closest associates were right there. His Lord himself was within reach. And he still began to sink. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come all together? We stand and while we sing.